Hey everybody, Mr. Krolex out today. So my name's Frank. I'm a brown bear. I'll be your your tutor today. So apparently you guys are working on sine and cosine, amplitude, period, frequency, stuff like that. Yeah. Okay. Alrighty. Well, let's take a look at what we got here. Okay. So over here you've got a general a chart that summarizes all the different things that you can get from an equation of a sine and a cosine graph. All right, this number that is out in front, we call it the A value. Okay, that affects the amplitude. That's the height of the curve. All right, the maximum value is A. So if this A was a 4, then the highest point here would be 4 and the lowest point would be -4. As long as the midline is still y equals 0. If it's a negative number out front, then what it does is it takes this graph and it flips it over the x-axis and you get that graph. Okay. All right. Now, the graph gets stretched if a is greater than 1. Okay, so the graph would get taller. So let's say that this was just your normal graph. If a was 4, then this height is going to be 4 times taller, and this is going to go 4 times farther down. That was our amplitude. Okay. Alrighty. Now, what we're going to talk about today is the b value. Okay, that's the number that is in front of the x, and it could be positive, it could be negative, it could be a fraction. All right, what this tells you is the number of cycles that occur between 0 and 2 pi. All right, so the number of cycles is referred to as the frequency. Now, this we use to get how long the period is. So to figure out the period, you take 2 pi and you divide it by whatever that number is. All right, so let's take a look at what these look like with some examples. Okay, all righty. So this first graph here is just your normal sine graph. So this is y equals sine x. So the a value, even though there's nothing there, a would be 1, and b, there's nothing there, so b is also 1. Okay, so what that means is our amplitude is 1. So the highest this graph is going to go is 1 above, -1 below. All right, the B means you're going to see one cycle of sine. So here's one cycle of sine. It's this dark curve here. That's one cycle of sine in this space between 0 and 2 pi. Okay. So the B tells you how many cycles you're going to see that between 0 to 2 pi. Okay. Now to get the period, okay, the period is 2 pi divided by whatever b is. Well, b in this case is 1. So the period is still just 2 pi. All right, now that's your normal sine graph. Okay, now let's take a look at this one here. All right, so when I'm looking at this now, let's see what we got. Our midline is y equals 0. So I can see that this is the a value. It goes 2 up, 2 down. So A is going to be equal to 2. All right, now to get the B value, I want to look how many cycles do I see between 0 and 2 pi. So there's 0 and 2 pi. And when I look at that, I see one cycle of sine in that space. There's your cycle of sine. So B is equal to 1. So when B is equal to 1, the period is 2 pi. The amplitude of this graph is 2. All right, now if we look at this one over here, okay, here's one cycle of sine. Okay, here's this interval between 0 and 2 pi, so I only see one cycle. But this time my amplitude is only a half. It doesn't go up to 1. So A is equal to 1/2. So that's my amplitude. And B, I see one cycle of sine in that shaded area. So that means my period is 2 pi. I'm going to see one cycle every 2 pi. All right. Now back up to this one. All we did here was we flipped the graph. The graph flipped over. So what that means is A is equal to -1. The amplitude is always a positive number. So my amplitude is still 1. Okay, that's 1, that's -1. Even though all the negative does is flip it over the x-axis. Okay, here's one cycle of sine right there. And that's going to give me, my frequency is 1. And my period now is still going to be 2 pi. Alrighty, so let's see. B is 1, so the period is unchanged. It's still 2 pi. I see one cycle in this shaded area right here. Alrighty. So that's all we did on this one was change the A. The B's were always 1. The frequencies were always 1. Okay, now here with cosine, remember our cosine started at its max and its period is 2 pi. So here's the distance, the interval 2 pi, and you can see on all of these we see just one cycle of cosine in that shaded area. Okay, so what that tells us is the frequency for all of these is 1, which means the period for all of these is 2 pi. Every 2 pi units, this graph is going to repeat its cycle. Now the A value, that's our amplitude. Okay, so here A is equal to 1. So our amplitude is 1. So the equation for this first graph would be y equals 1 cosine 1x, which is just cosine x. All right, I think I messed up on this one. I think I wanted it to go the other way because I wanted to do a negative, so I'm going to do that instead. So just pretend this guy's not there. Krolak messed up. He makes a lot of mistakes, but he's trying. All right, so give him credit for that. All right, so A in this case, since it flipped, is -1. right? The amplitude is always a positive number, so amplitude is still 1. And this equation would be y equals negative 1 cosine bx. B is 1. So there's my equation. Okay? And I didn't do that on these here, so let me do that real quick. So this is 1 sine x. This is negative 1 sine x. Okay, this was y equals 2 sine 1x. And this one was y equals 1/2 sine 1x. Okay, alrighty. Now, all of these examples so far have only dealt with the amplitude. So now let's take a look at when we start changing the frequency. Alrighty, so here's our normal graph. Okay, A is 1, so our amplitude is 1. B is 1, so our period is 2 pi. Now remember, the frequency, guys, is the B. That's what the frequency is. To get the period, you take 2 pi and you divide it by B. All right, so this equation is just our parent function 1 sine 1x. All right, now if you look at the next one here, you see more than one cycle. Okay, all right, so I can see more than one cycle here. I can see 2 cycles of sine in that shaded area. That shaded area goes from 0 to 2 pi. So here is 1 cycle of sine. And here is another cycle of sine. So in that area right there, I have 2 cycles. So that tells me that my B value is 2. To get the period, I take 2 pi and I divide it by 2. So the period of this thing is pi. All right, the amplitude is 1. So A is 1, so my amplitude is 1. So if I was going to write this equation, it would be y equals A, which is 1. This is a sine curve. B now is 2. So I'd write 2x. Okay, so this number right here, this B, is how many cycles you see between 0 and 2 pi. All right, let's take a look at the next guy here. Okay, now we see a whole bunch of cycles. All right, so if I was going to do these cycles here, there's 1 cycle of sine. Here's another cycle of sine. There's 2 of them. And then you'll see I'm going to get 2 more in here. There's 3. And there's 4. So this is 4 cycles. So my B is 4, and my period is now going to be 2 pi divided by 4, which is pi over 2. Or it can be written as 1/2 pi. It's the same thing. Okay, it repeats every 1/2 pi. Amplitude is still 1. Okay, so A is 1, so my amplitude is 1. So this equation would be y equals A is 1, this is a sine graph, and B is 4. So this would be 4x. Alrighty. Now, this graph is kind of sneaky, this one up here, because it looks like it's the first graph just flipped over. If I took this graph and flipped it over, okay, so this graph could be a y equals negative sine x. Okay, but what happened on this one was, instead of flipping it over the x-axis this way, I flipped it over the y-axis. Okay, so you can see this part right here in black moved over to here. So you can't tell, they look the same. So this equation, these two are the same thing. And whether or not you realize that, you already knew that. Okay, that's called an odd function. Remember we talked about if you took that graph and turned it upside down, it would look the same. That's what makes it an odd function. Odd, kind of like your teacher. Alrighty. Okay, now our amplitude here, 1. It's going up first, so we know A is positive. Okay, now when we look at the space between 0 and 2 pi, I don't see a full cycle. I only see half of a cycle. So what that tells me is my B value is now 1/2. So to get my period, I take 2 pi and I divide it by 1/2. Well, dividing by 1/2 is the same as multiplying by a reciprocal. And I get 4 pi. That's the period. And now if you look at it, you see a full cycle of sine occurs when it reaches 4 pi. So this equation would be y equals 1 sine. And now the B value is 1/2 x. Or it can be written like this, x over 2. Same thing. Alrighty. Okay, now this one, here's between 0 and 2 pi. Okay, I see less than half of a cycle. Okay, because it starts to go down. So if you look at this, in this case, I don't know, okay, how much of that sine graph is this part here? Okay, so it's a little different than here. You see on this one previous one up here, guys? Right here next to my nose. Okay, that's half of a cycle. Okay, this is a little bit less than half of a cycle. All right, so to figure out the B value here, what we're going to do is we're going to work backwards from the period. All right, so the period, it takes 6 pi to be the period. So to work backwards and get B, I use the formula that the period is equal to 2 pi divided by B. Okay, so now I'm going to solve this. So I'm going to multiply both sides by b. Okay, those cancel, and I get b, b times 6 pi equals 2 pi. Now I'm going to divide both sides by 6 pi. And let's see, those cancel, and I get b is equal to, those cancel, 1/3. So our a value, our amplitude is 1. Our b value is 1/3. And we got that by taking the period and working backwards. So this as an equation would be 1 sine, and this would be 1/3 x. So this is 1/3 of a cycle. That's the frequency. We see 1/3 of the graph between 0 and 2 pi. That's what this is telling you. One-third of the sine graph between 0 and 2 pi. Okay, just like this one up here, guys, you saw 1/2 a sine curve between 0 and 2 pi. Alrighty. Okay. All right, now this next one is just cosine. So we're doing the exact same thing. All right. We see one cycle of cosine. So this is one cycle. So b is equal to 1. And then your period is 2 pi divided by whatever b is. So that's just 2 pi. Our amplitude is 1. So then our, whoops, get that out of there. Okay. My equation would be y equals 1. This is a cosine graph, 1x. So that's just your normal cosine. All right, now when you take cosine and you flip it over the y-axis, it looks the same. That's what happened right here. Okay, this black portion that I'm highlighting, when you flip it over, it's now right here, and it looks the same. Okay, so this is actually y equals cosine negative x. Okay, so the b value is -1. The period is still a positive number, even though you're dividing it by -1. Period is a length, so it's just saying that this graph repeats every 2 pi units. Right? So when the whole point on this is the b value, that flips the graph right and left if it's negative. The a value, if it's negative, flips the graph up and down. Okay? Alrighty. Okay, now we look at the cosine here, and I see one cycle of cosine and a second cycle. So I know b is equal to 2. So the new period is 2 pi divided by 2 pi. My amplitude is still 1. So y equals 1 cosine 2x. There's 2 cycles. All right, over here to my left, there we go. These green screens kind of get you screwed mixed up. All right. So now I see just 1/2 of a cycle of the cosine. So I know b is 1/2. So between 0 and 2 pi, I just see half the graph. So now my period is 2 pi divided by 1/2, which is 2 pi times 2/1, which is 4 pi. So you can see, to see a full cycle of cosine, you have to go all the way to 4 pi. Amplitude is still 1, so my equation, 1 cosine 1/2 x, or cosine x over 2, same thing. Okay, now over here, we got, I see there's 1 cycle of cosine, 2 cycles, 3 cycles, 4 cycles. So b is 4. Between 0 and 2 pi, I see 4 cycles. So my period is going to be 2 pi divided by 4, which is equal to pi over 2. A is still 1, so my equation is 1 cosine 4x, because I see 4 cycles between 0 and 2 pi. And now the last one, okay, we see, looks like okay, that's not quite a half like we saw over here. A half of a cycle goes to there, so that's less than half of a cycle. So let's take a look and see if we can figure out. This would be half of a cycle, so then to here is just a quarter of a cycle. So that tells me 1/4 of a cycle. So b, 1/4, my period, 2 pi divided by 1/4. That's 8 pi. And you could see now, this thing doesn't repeat until it gets all the way to 8 pi. Okay, our a value is 1. Okay, so our equation here is y equals 1 cosine b is 1/4 x. All right, folks, just about done here. So this next section, you're given the equation now, and you want to find the amplitude and the period. So this is our amplitude. So on all of these problems here, our amplitude, remember, amplitude is always positive. All this negative does is it flips it over the x-axis. Okay, amplitude is still a positive number. Okay, so right here, amplitude is still positive 2. Amplitude here, 3. Okay, all that negative does is it flips it over the x-axis. All right, now to get the periods, you take the period is equal to 2 pi divided by b. So b in this case is a half. So this would be 2 pi divided by 1/2, which is equal to 4 pi. That's my period. And you can see, in order for you to see a full cycle of sine, it takes from 0 to 4 pi for that to happen. Okay, so right over here, guys, is you can click on these links, or I provided the links on Google Classroom, and you can graph these. Okay, so for example, if I click on the first link here, it's the sine graph. Okay, and now all you do is you just change these values. Right now, you're going to always leave D. D right here is going to be 0. All right, and then you change by using the sliders. You're going to change the values of A and B. All righty, so in that last example, what was it? Darn it. Let's see, A was 4, B was 1/2. All right, so I'm just going to take this right here. There should be a slider, but I can just make that 4. All right, and now I'm going to take the B value, that's 1/2, and it's already 1/2. That's the graph. Okay, so that's changing the B value right there. Okay, the second one on here, all right, you had -4, 3x. So I'm going to take my graph here, and I'm going to make this -4. That's my A value. You see that flipped it. And now I'm going to make my B value 3. And there's my graph. You see 3 cycles of it between 0 and 2 pi. Right? Okay, so down here, our B value was equal to 3. So the period is going to be 2 pi divided by 3. And you can't do anything to that. So you just leave it as 2/3, 2 pi over 3. That's the period. My amplitude was 4. Okay, all right. Now, if you click on these icons, it'll take you to a cosine graph. All right, so we already identified our amplitude. It's positive. That negative just made it flip over the x-axis. Okay, B is equal to 2/3. So my period is 2 pi divided by 2/3. So 2 pi over 1 times 3 over 2. The 2's cancel, and I end up with a period of 3 pi. So it takes me 3 pi to see a full cycle. There's one cycle of an upside down sine, or upside down cosine, because of the negative. And it goes from 2 to -2. Alrighty, last one. Yippee. I am hungry for some honey. Alrighty. Yeah, bears do like honey. It's not just Winnie the Pooh. Okay, so amplitude 3. Period is going to be 2 pi divided by b, which in this case is 2 pi divided by 5. You can't do anything to that, so you leave it alone. Okay, now to graph these, If you click on the link up here, right there, then here's your cosine graph. And then you just adjust these sliders to whatever your values are. So for example, that last one, A was equal to 3. D stays alone. D raises it up and down. So we're not going to do that yet. And then B was equal to 5. So I just slide that out to 5, and that's what my graph looks like. Ah, okay, there it is. So there's 5 cycles of cosine in that purple area. All right, guys, it's been great filling in. I don't know when Krolak will have me back, but take care, and I'll see you next time.